I am live. I'm reading The Laird and the Lady. We're now in chapter 14. It is a novel by Joan Marshall Grant. She wrote books about her own far memories, her previous lives, one of them in Egypt, over 10,000 years ago, as Sikita. Fascinating, entitled Winged Pharaoh. Anyhow, we are here much more further on in time. This was published 1949, and it is entitled, this chapter, Honeymoon in Paris. Marylda had always been impatient with people who bought something they could not reasonably afford and then whined about the cost. She had bought at least temporary joy, a kind of joy which she had never expected to find, and she had bought it with lies because there was no other way to get it. She was not going to let it be spoiled by futile anxiety. Perhaps Rowan would understand, and not even be angry with her. He might realize it was really a compliment that she was so eager to play the beggar maid to his copetua. They were in youth and in love, and if sometimes they were irresponsible only by a deliberate effort, this was no more than a speck on the mirror of the bright present. They went to Longchamps, and Rowan won 4,000 francs on an unlikely-looking horse which he backed because it was called Lochinvar, which proves that it is much better to follow a hunch than to bother with probabilities, he said, as they walked arm in arm to the paddock from the tote where he had collected his winnings. That he lost it all on the next race without a flicker of regret was another sign of how much he had learned in 3 weeks. They went to Luna Park, and she was suitably impressed when he drew an admiring audience at the shooting gallery, and he felt a wave of almost unbearable protectiveness when she clung to him as they swept down the giant racer. They explored the Quarter Latin and stood in front of a little shop which displayed students' pictures, arguing about the rival merits of what appeared to be a lemon on a soap dish a long way after Picasso, and a pink lady about to slide off a sofa who was even further behind Matisse. They went up to the Eiffel Tower and had ices in the cafe. They had supper at the Bal Tabarin, and Rowan became a little pompous after the second bottle of champagne and insisted on explaining to Marylda exactly why she was so much more beautiful than any of the exotic young women who pointed their charm with ostrich feathers and small nets of brilliance. He became argumentative as to whether her skin had the texture of a gardenia or whether she was correct to accuse him of exaggeration. She thought he had forgotten all about it until she came back from the hairdresser the following evening and found he had bought 10 dozen gardenias and spread them on the bed as a background for her. The correlation of the evidence proved so satisfactory that they were 2 hours late for the table they had booked at Maxime's. At Fontainebleau they neglected to visit the Chateau, because after lunching at a restaurant which pretended to be a hunting lodge, it seemed more appropriate to play nymph and shepherd in a secluded forest glade. In the Palace of Versailles, Rowan pretended to be a history student from Aberdeen and proceeded to make pungent comments until the attention of the guided herd of American tourists shifted from the monotone recital of their temporary controller. In a stage whisper, Rowan enlarged on the peculiar virtues, though, mind you, the more solid members of the Kirk might call them by a different name, of entirely apocryphal ladies who had inhabited these vast and echoing rooms. Bed curtains, you will notice, he said sententiously, a heathen practice required by those who have too many privacies to conceal. The guide, resigned that he would not get even his usual 20 francs from these foreign bourgeois, eyed them with disfavour as they hung back to let the rest of the crowd disperse. Suddenly, the young man at whom the girls smiled as though there was no other Roi Soleil became the Englishman to whom it was automatic to touch his cap, which startled him even more than the 500-franc note that appeared on his outstretched palm. "Worth it," said Rowan, his hand under Marylda's elbow as he steered her past the huddle that were dutifully inspecting the Hall of Mirrors. Seldom enjoyed myself more. There were other occasions she did not find so restful, though they further increased her devotion. They had followed the river below the lightened avenues bordering the Seine, close to the water which kept its secret darkness even at the heart of the city. Two men, standing beside a barge, made no more than a casual remark about the girl who passed them. In their own argot, it was even complimentary. Rowan swung around and said in careful, clipped French, "I should suggest you repeat that remark slowly, so that I cannot misunderstand." If it had not been for the presence of a friend, the bargee would have said he was only remarking on the admirable contours of a plane tree on the opposite bank. But the assurance of being in the majority made him overbold, and he repeated his remark, spitting on the cobbles to show he was not to be intimidated. Fists can be quicker than knives. At the second splash Rowan adjusted his coat, panting a little, but well pleased. Already a boat hook had appeared on the far side of the barge, and in the light from the hatch 2 heads appeared, swimming at least strongly enough to be retrieved. "Darling, need you do that very often?" said Marylda, who in those few seconds had seen Rowan knifed, watched while he died, mourned by his bier, and suffered the ultimate shame of having stood helpless while he did battle in her name. Rowan put his arm around her shoulder and sucked the bruised knuckles on his other hand. "As nice a right and left as I've seen for years," he said contentedly. "My darling, wasn't it naughty to hit them quite so hard? You couldn't expect me to let that remark pass. It wouldn't have been decent. So now I know," he thought, "why I fought so bloody hard at school. If not, how could I be strong enough to guard her?" But being a Scot, he only said aloud, "I think we've earned a drink." In the Boulevard Saint-Michel they found a bar still showing a light and a bottle of real whiskey waiting to be opened for them. Though Rowan disliked shopping, he preferred accompanying Marylda to being deprived of her company. He wore the ties she bought at Sucre, and let her choose a new dressing gown for him, in claret-coloured brocade, with his monogram embroidered on the pocket. She had no idea how difficult he had found it to complete the gesture by giving his ragged foulard to the valet. "If I was a Mohammedan, I should still require no other wives," said Rowan, who, after rowing the boat they had hired at Senlis, was basking on the warm gravel of an islet in the Seine. "In your most delightful person you contain a harem. Should I be in the mood to act the buffoon, you echo it. If a head waiter does not immediately recognize your quality and conduct as to the best table, you become an empress, and he object." "Do I?" she said. "Darling, how clever of me. I never knew. Consider the ambassadeurs. We went there with no more than a sheet from Malcolm. They had reserved for us an inconspicuous corner in which we could be no demerit to the establishment. What did you do? Nothing. That was the beauty of it. You raised your eyebrows a trifle, but those eyebrows gently indicated that you were a little amused that even when slumming your incognito had been effective." He did not notice that she shivered as though a sudden cold wind disturbed the long leaves of the drowsing willows. "You're not constrained by the obligations either of mortality or of Olympus," he said contentedly. "You accepted 2 Pernots from a taxi driver in that unsavory joint we found ourselves in at about 3 a.m. 2 days ago in a manner which made him feel an honoured host. And here's another reason why we are happier than any other lovers, whether married or not. We both like the same kind of food. We both agree that conversation early in the morning is barbarous, unless it is very early, when of course it comes under a different set of laws." "You flatter me, or yourself, too much," she said. "Have I ever shared those eggs that bake in those impermeable omelettes? Have I ever asked for more than a coffee, a cigarette, and a decent interval in which to wait?" He grinned. "One has a certain convention to maintain at home and abroad. For what reason the inherited digestive tract should demand sustenance at a certain hour is not my concern. Why do Scots eat oatmeal? Why should it be consumed in an upright position with salt, rather than in the manner of the Sassenach, seated with cream and sugar. Why is cold grouse better before 9 in the morning than any other hour? One is not expected to produce answers sufficient that one accepts. Have I got to eat grouse for breakfast in Scotland? My darling, for you I will break down the last bulwarks of the Highlands. You shall have coffee, and in bed. After all, said Marylda, not realizing how great a concession she received, I think it's not altogether unusual. It's not altogether usual for you to picnic on slices of garlic sausage and cherries, thin beer and undistinguished cheese from a paper bag. But have you ever enjoyed a meal more? Never, he said. But then I must admit that on no previous occasion did I have an aperitif the sight of you swimming. They drove back to Paris through a dove-greased dusk, for they had found a little auberge which it would have been absurd to pass. A blue rectangle was propped against a vase of phlox, whose red and pink and purple they had brought home the morning before from the flower market on the Isle de la Cité. It's a telegram, said Marylda, who, since it was addressed to Rowan, was not alarmed. Probably it was from Duncan, who was staying with friends near Orleans. Rowan tore it open and saw him suddenly stiffen. He read it twice and then handed it to her. Hear extraordinary rumour you are married. Please deny or return immediately, Georgina. Well, she had to know soon, said Marylda, though I suppose we ought to have told her. Had you better ring her up? Rowan exploded. Good God! Explain to Georgina on the telephone with the entire village listening in? Didn't you notice that it was sent from Inverness? She drove 50 miles before she'd even risk a telegram. Well, send a non-committal reply and explain in a letter. I'll write too if you think it will help. Can't you read? It was Rowan. It was a Rowan she had never before seen who shouted at her. He tore the telegram from her hand and underlined the words with a nail of a forefinger which scoured into the paper. Deny or return immediately. For a moment he realized she was frightened, and his own fear receded, sufficiently for him to become almost conciliatory. We can't deny it, and neither of us want to. You aren't ashamed of having eloped with me, are you? Oh, of course not, Rowan, darling. This isn't anything really important. Nothing that can affect us. Only an old woman who doesn't understand, to whom we must be a little gentle until we've had a chance to explain. He picked up the telephone and demanded the hall porter. Get me 2 seats on the morning train. Where to? London, of course. It leaves at 11. Good. Wire London and book 2 sleepers to Inverness, either on the train leaving Euston at 1900 hours or the midnight mail. Marylda, who at first had shared his anxiety, was now annoyed. Really, this was ridiculous fuss to make about a telegram from a tetsy old woman. How silly of Rowan to make all these ill-considered plans without having the courtesy to consult her. However, it would probably be salutary for him to discover that she could on occasion be far more practical than he. She sat in an armchair in a pose of deliberate negligence, her ankles crossed, a cigarette held in carefully flexed fingers. Darling, wouldn't it be more intelligent to ring up Boulogne? We've a booking on the auto carrier in 10 days, and we may be able to get one sooner. Surely Georgina wouldn't expect us to abandon a perfectly good car. His immediate acceptance of her advice made her feel guilty at having offered it with sarcasm. He seized the telephone again and demanded to be reconnected with the hall porter. Cancel those train reservations, get on to Boulogne and ask them whether they can take my car tomorrow. The office doesn't open till 10? Well, when does the passenger boat sail? All right then, call us at 6:30. He slammed down the receiver. If we can't get a passage for the car, we'll have to leave it with the AA. There, and they'll ship it when they can and arrange for someone to drive it north. Is all this really necessary? Is all this really necessary? Said Marylda. I don't know where it stopped, and I'll better finish here then, because it mutes when it was battery empty. We are in honeymoon in Paris, and I will finish this later.